Limi, can you hear me? I was in 2020 for a moment. My mic was on mute.
Huh?
But now that that's been sorted out, we look to build up on much that you've had highlighted here today, and I do think really is pressing in terms of that trust. It will be something that will be echoed later on in our conversation today as to how we do build that trust, especially if we take a look at the context of the African environment, global South environment, and how it is that we partner and interplay with our global peers across the stage. So that's a key theme that we will be reflecting on and seeking further clarity on as we build up on much more of these themes. I'm looking for my panel, and I understand that they are on standby, going to engage on a key conversation that helps us understand how best it is that we leverage the opportunities and adapt and mobilize the capabilities that are required in this environment. I'm going to introduce our panelists who will be joining us for this critical conversation, one that will help us provide a lot more color and context around what is required from a labor and skills point of view, as we have a representative from LinkedIn, a digital platform within itself that has really been able to leverage and mobilize a lot more opportunities that are available and credible to many peers and partners. We'll also be hearing from instrumental players who work for global technology firms like Google. Beyond just working as a search engine, they've really altered the way that we interact with technology, how it is that we so easily adopt much of the solutions and technology that they're able to bring to the fore. We'll also hear from key partners and players who themselves, proudly rooted on the African continent, have been able to adequately use and penetrate the business opportunities using technology as a key enabler. And that in itself will also help us understand how we use that as the toolkit to continue to implement in new markets going forward. And of course, what does this mean from a labor point of view? Our guests will join us on stage to give us a better perspective and understanding into these key themes and a better understanding as to why it does remain important. Beyond that, we'll also be hearing from our moderator who will be joining us today to give us a conversation and theme into direction around AI, specifically given his link and support for all things artificial intelligence, helping to assist with policy direction, not only in terms of how developed economies are embarking upon this journey, but also understanding the interplay with key partners across the rest of the continent. I'll welcome our moderator up on stage. He will be joined by our panelists from the organizations that I've mentioned. And beyond that, we'll also give you some context and color into the role and function that they will be responding to on the panel. Please can we also warmly welcome to the front of the stage Professor Euvin Naidoo. He'll be joining us again in conversation today to help us welcome our panelists and provide color, clarity, and context to our next session. Thank you so much. A warm welcome to Professor Naidoo.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We have a fantastic topic, and I'd love to invite our esteemed panelists to come and join me so we can get right in. I am absolutely thrilled as our panelists come on stage to welcome each one of them, some old friends and some new friends. Let's get started. We have a terrific topic, the adaptability imperative. Leadership and learning in the age of intelligent systems, and carefully crafted by our colleagues at the B20, because it's not about artificial intelligence, it's about intelligent systems. I'm thrilled to introduce, I will not do justice to the introductions, but Alan Blue, Vice President of Product Management and critically a co-founder of LinkedIn, someone who was there from the very start of this journey. We very much look forward to that global view. He's joined by Alex Okosi. Alex, I have to come onto panels to meet you, Okosi, these days. Google Africa.
Indeed.
And we're going to be digging into the global mindset. Bettina, Schaller, President of the World Employment Confederation. We're going to bring it and make it very real in terms of the impact on the ground. And last but not least, a dear friend, someone who began with me years ago at McKinsey & Company, the unbelievable, brilliant Fred Swanica. Let's get into it. I want to kick off with you, Alan, from the big picture. I sit on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on the Future of Job Creation with Eric Brynfelsen from Stanford. And Eric coined this phrase which has spread around the world. It is not artificial intelligence that's going to replace humans. It's people who know AI that will be replacing humans. You're at LinkedIn, the nexus of a number of people here. And your statistic is that 70% of job skills will change by 2030. Let's pause. 70%. Tell us the patterns that you are seeing and how LinkedIn is seeing this evolution. Because in that lies both the opportunity but also the anxiety of many facing this change.
And it's understandably anxiety-provoking to think that so much of the work that you do right now is going to be different in just a few years than it is today. So one of the questions that we get asked a lot is, how do you prepare for it? How do you think about the skills that you need as an individual to face that change which is coming down the line? And I think there's actually a really good metaphor which has been coming up in the Silicon Valley for a while, which is that working with artificial intelligence is kind of like working with interns, which is to say you've got some people who do some work and they don't do it great, so you need to correct them and you need to improve their behavior over time. And over time, they learn what they're doing and they become part of your team. I think it's actually a really powerful metaphor, and I want to kind of explore what it might actually mean. So what do you need to be a successful worker in the workplace today? And it seems like, in addition to soft skills, which are always really important and an essential thing to anybody working, and certainly will be true on an ongoing basis, you need basically to have what I'm going to call general management skills. Because in the end, what you're going to be asked to be is, one, an expert in your area of focus, so an expert engineer or an expert supply chain manager, etc. And you're going to be asked to deploy a bunch of agents on your behalf to make you much more productive. So it's almost like you're a little executive, and that requires you to know how to understand what the company's goals are. It requires you to understand how to innovate on the process that you're actually undertaking, so that you're acting like essentially like a little manager, like a little executive within the company. That's actually a different set of skills than we normally teach people today. Because normally people don't come to that set of ideas where I'm running a small team until later in their careers. We need to pull that forward in order to make sure people can actually deploy those. This is, of course, built on top of knowledge of how to work effectively with artificial intelligences. And that's kind of the equivalent of, how do I give good instructions to my workers about the things I need to get done? And how do I evaluate whether what they're producing is valuable? Now, for the employer, the person who's managing this set of new executives at a company, I think the story is basically, you got to answer the question you would answer for any executive. So if you're an executive today, say you're a CEO, and I'm sure there are CEOs in the room, when you're dealing with executives, you don't tell them how to do their job. What you do is you make sure you've really clearly established the mission and vision for the company. You tell people what they're responsible for. You hold them accountable for it by telling them, by making sure that they actually deliver on it. And then you give them the tools they need to build their own process and innovate in terms of delivering those things. So it's a pretty standard thing, again, at a sort of an executive level. That's actually a pretty good picture, I think, of how we might think about how skills change on a go-forward basis. So be an expert in your area, build a team of artificial intelligence, which is actually able to make you successful. And if you're a manager managing them, make sure that they understand what you're trying to achieve, they're being held accountable for it, and that they have the tools necessary to innovate. And I'll only add one other thing. If you're a manager or if you're a leader at a company like this, one thing to remember is that artificial intelligence is going to separate employees from each other, right? Because we're going to spend a lot more time with the tools that we are actually using, and collaboration will be a lower value in the future than it is right now. So what that means is that a new thing that leaders will need to do is they're going to need to figure out how to build community among a group of executives who have less and less reason to speak to each other.
Fantastic, fantastic. Alan, you've painted a picture of the promise of artificial intelligence, of this move from where we are now, which is engaging our large language models, very quickly moving into this world of agentic AI,
Yep.
which you spoke about. AI enabling from end to end. The changing of workflows is going to be important, and ultimately to physical AI. Embedded in that is extreme redefining of what it means to be productive and how to work. And Bettina, you are engaging with communities all around the world. We often say that there are at least two communities. Those that are leaning in and cannot wait for this world, and there's another group that's panicking in terms of what does it mean for me? Because ultimately this is impacting people on the ground. What are you getting from those conversations that you are having? And what do you think is the role of employers around the world to help people through this journey?
Listen, first of all, obviously delighted to be here, and I'd like to echo those who recognize the great work done by the B20. It is absolutely crucial to have this voice of business around the table, and of course proud here to represent the World Employment Confederation. Wadang, you asked if there's the tech industry, the financial services industry in the room. Well, there's also the private employment services industry in the room. Delighted to represent those, of course, in the name of the global employers. No, and you're absolutely right. There is a huge question around, well, how are we going to, in this new system, be able to bring the actual productivity to the table? Currently, to say it very bluntly, it's too early days to actually identify how that's going to be done. And so we're reverting back to the main issue that we see, which is to provide people with the right skills, to make sure that the investments that we are making, which of course are in parabolic, I don't even know the terminology, numbers when it comes to tech companies, infrastructure that is being put up, when it comes to patents that are being created, again, on the technology side, well, that those investments also go into that skilling and the literacy piece of things. And so all the conversations that we are having from the business perspective in that global employment context are around the need to skill, the need to provide the literacy, the need to bring everybody on board, to demystify, and then to be able to establish the link between, well, what the businesses are looking for and what the demand and the supply, what the workers can bring.
Fantastic. Yet the anxiety levels amongst workers is quite high. There's this gap between re-kitting and retooling, which we see as being important, and getting the engine started. The challenge is that in many organizations, in the absence of defined AI policy, it's gone underground in many of these workforces. How are you talking to your community in the sense of setting AI standards, education, examples, or do you find many of your colleagues are still looking at it as something that is through the risk lens being a challenge? Where are they in this as unlocking the potential to seeing it as still very risky in terms of governance and control, because there's so much information that could be at risk?
It actually, again, one has to give a nuanced answer. It depends on the size of the organization, depends also on the geography where the organization is located. We know these days, and we see it, businesses, companies based in the EU have that risk-based approach indeed. They're going at it very thoroughly. They're applying processes and mechanisms that are highly risk-oriented, of course. We see that less in other geographies. Having said that, if you're a global employer these days that operates in the European Union context, of course, well, then you're going to have to apply that as well. Again, the size of the organization. Big employers these days are absolutely geared towards providing the tools to their staff, to the workers. They're also more and more geared, in partnership, as we heard today, to working with the partners, the supply chain, and to bringing very often huge literacy programs that they've set up themselves down into that chain as well. let's again not forget, 3 years ago, nobody was talking about this, right? We mentioned agents right now. I was in Davos in January. Nobody was talking about agents then, or maybe just a few tech geeks, if I can say so. Now it is in on everybody's mind. So it is early days. We're all shouting for and obviously seeing the anxiety side, but actually I think we will find a way where we move away from the risk side and then see the innovation side. For businesses, that is the key. It's that innovation, the potential that technology brings, and what it will also then be unleashing with workers and that productive human workforce that we're so interested in.
Wonderful. Speaking of a global and large organizations, I want to bring it to Alex and Google, and what a time it has been for Google. From 2024 ending with Notebook LM to 2025 with Nano Banana, which has delighted my students.
Fantastic.
And finally, congrats on your Gemini release.
Yep.
How are you thinking about this internally at Google, because you are bringing folks along, but also externally, because you are the ecosystem, the Google suite that so many often have their first and continuous experiences with AI bringing them up the curve?
Look, first of all, thank you for the congratulations. Good afternoon. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. Look, I think our focus has really been on how do we make sure that AI works on the continent. And again, that's my focus, right? We have great products, as you mentioned. The innovations we've had in AI has been tremendous, especially as you look at our chatbots, Gemini, et cetera. However, how do we ensure that that the digital divide that we know in this continent doesn't become an AI divide? And the only way that we really want to focus on being able to tackle that is something that you mentioned earlier, which is on skilling. When you think about it, depending on whose estimate you look at, it can be $1.2 trillion that it adds to the African economies over the next 3 years. That's conservative in some people's estimations. But to be able to really capture that, you need to have a skilled workforce. Africa holds only 1% of the global AI talent. How do you build that? And it's certainly not just Google that will do it, but for us, there's been a focus on how do we do that, and how do we look at it from a kind of a 3-tier strategy of skilling. One is which we are really working on is how do we really invest in the learners? How do we ensure that we are developing curricula, AI curricula, in partnership with institutions that are at the grassroots level? We have an initiative now called Experience AI, where we're really trying to educate the educators so that they're able to educate the learners, right? So students. So we want to train 25,000 students. This is one of our initiatives. And in turn, they'll train 125,000 teachers to train 125,000 students. So that's one tier of it. The other piece of it is, how do you then also enable the small businesses? Small businesses make up a huge chunk of being able to drive this continent's growth. And again, our focus is on using our several initiatives to be able to drive AI skills, to be able to ensure that these small businesses are really implementing AI into their work streams so they can unlock more growth and unlock more innovation. And then the other piece is really our focus on how do we also ensure that we are enabling innovators to innovate, right? And one of the areas we've been really focused on is the diversity of languages we have on the ground. People are going to be able to create better, be able to drive AI innovation if we focus on language inclusion. So we're now really being able to invest in grants to partner with institutions on being able to unlock open source data related to languages so that innovators and creatives can actually build on top of that AI solutions from an Africa perspective. Because the only way that we can really make sure that we are building solutions that matter to our communities is that if it's being built in Igbo, in Yoruba, in Zulu, in Twi. So that's one of the key areas that we're focusing on beyond the infrastructure bills and things that we're investing in, is really how do we make sure that from a skills perspective, we're not left behind, because what we don't want to do is, the exponential growth of AI means that they will be exponentially left behind unless Africa is at the forefront of creating solutions for its own.
I want to pick up, if I may, just this element, because it's so important. And Google is a fantastic actor in that skilling space. And this is where private sector business is really stepping up. We've never in the history have seen so many organizations, and of course the tech companies are leading that way in providing most of the time free free skilling opportunities. I've been involved for almost 2 decades now in this whole, what do education systems need to look like, what do labor markets need to adapt in order to, well, make sure that workers actually meet the requirements of businesses. And when it comes to that AI skilling piece and digital skilling piece, we're really ahead of the curve on that one. So I want to encourage everybody, there is actually no excuse not to go out there and tap into one of those free skilling offers. The IOE itself has engaged in a partnership with Microsoft right now. There's going to be more coming, where all the 50 million companies that are part of the IOE network can access again that free skilling piece. So an unbelievable, incredible movement we're actually in right now. I think the complication is actually to make sense out of that landscape of huge offering, and then to understand, okay, which program then actually will lead me to the job that I'm looking for, right? So this is something we're working on as well. Give us a bit of time. But I'm actually very, again, hopeful and really want to pick out this incredible effort that's been driven by the private sector to meet and to fill that void.
Fantastic. I want to bring these themes home of skilling, upskilling, reskilling, new skilling to someone who's really set the bar and has been an innovator. Fred Swanica, you had a vision of creating a new generation of leaders on the African continent. And someone whom we both know very well, Bob Sternfels from McKinsey, who recruited both of us more than 2 decades ago as amongst the first folks to join McKinsey Johannesburg, yes. Caught up with Bob about a year ago. And he said something quite interesting, and we were thinking about you. He said, we are entering an era of never graduating. Never graduating. You are in the business of helping a new generation of young African leaders really define adaptable, critical problem solving. How are you equipping your leaders in this age of AI to continue this acceleration? And what are the patterns and trends that you are seeing in terms of the new skill sets that are needed for this new workforce?
Thank you, Euvin. Yeah, great to hear about Bob. So, I mean, the way we look at it is that the half-life of knowledge is getting shorter and shorter and shorter, right? So before you go to school and you might have a career, or you might, what you learned might actually be relevant for the job that you do. Now, before you even finish college, you're out of date, right? So we believe that what matters when you go to school is actually not learning any specific content, but rather learning how to learn, right? And learning how to solve problems. Because that will always be in fashion, right? And so your ability to keep learning becomes much more crucial in this moment that we live in. And so, you know, if I look at the work we've been doing, the African Leadership Group, we started about 20 years ago. We started one small school called the African Leadership Academy in South Africa. And then we built a couple of universities called African Leadership University. And then 7 years ago, we saw that technology was becoming a very powerful force in the world. So we started equipping these leaders with technology skills. But the other thing that we believe is very important in this age is that we don't forget what it means to be human as we work with technology. So before we train the leaders we're developing in software engineering and you know, data science and data analytics and all these skills that they need right now, and robotics, etc. We first take them through a foundation of ethics and values. And we expose them to the problems of the world. Healthcare, education, climate change, you know, infrastructure. And then we say, don't choose an academic major, choose a mission. Because in the time of AI, the what becomes easier. The why matters more. You've got to have a purpose, you've got to have a passion. So we imbue them with that purpose of solving problems, give them something to care about that they're actually going to want to solve. Because now they've got superpowers to solve those problems, right? And then with that, you unleash a whole new wave of creativity and hopefulness. And so we're seeing, for example, significant improvements in you know, the capabilities of the talent that we're developing, because now they have a purpose, they have the right ethics and values, and then they're given these superpowers to solve big problems. The last thing I'll talk about is that as we think about this whole moment of, you know, machines and humans, we should be very careful to not fall into what has happened in previous waves of technology when, Robert Solow won the Nobel Prize for identifying this thing that they called the productivity paradox, where a lot of investments were being made in technology, but they were not seeing any improvements in productivity. And that's because they forgot the humans. And unless we change the way humans work, the workflows, you upskill them, you get them to actually think of themselves as companions to the machines, we're not going to actually see any productivity improvements. So it's very important that as we develop the next generation, we're also going into people who are already in the workforce, and we reskill them. Everything from the CEO to the middle. We've got a course called the AI Career Essentials, where everyone, even your grandmother, can learn how to use these generative AI skills in 6 weeks. And then when you start to get everyone from the board of directors to the C-suite, to the middle-level managers, to the frontline workers, all thinking about how they work with technology, then we'll start to see these productivity improvements.
Fantastic. And I think Fred raises some powerful themes that this offers an opportunity across geography, gender, age group. This is the promise. And I want to bring it back and use the brain trust of the panel, of this world in which knowledge is on tap, the democratization of knowledge, this ability that you're limited by your question. And on our council at the World Economic Forum, one of the things we speak about that it's no longer just about problem solving and critical thinking. We want to train a generation of problem seekers. This ability to actually search and enhance your ability to find the right problem. In this ecosystem, each of you here who are interdisciplinary leaders, if you had a blank sheet of paper to advise government and business to best prepare for this world to come, which has the challenge of lifting so many, but also creating a divide, what would that advice be? Government, business, other stakeholders. I'm going to start with LinkedIn, who sees these patterns and has also committed your platform, by the way, to pivot from connectivity to also education, and a remarkable education platform.
Yeah. So recently LinkedIn released a new product, which is called LinkedIn Hiring Assistant. And basically it's a hiring assistant. It helps people who are hiring through the LinkedIn platform do the job more effectively. And it actually saves between 1 and 5 hours of work per job that you hire, which is actually a pretty substantial productivity boost. When I've gone and met with these customers, I always ask one question of them, and that is, okay, so what are you going to do with those extra 5 hours? And I think much of what the future looks like depends on how we decide to spend that newfound time that we get. And for me, if I'm an HR professional, then I would love to spend those 5 hours ensuring the success of the person I hired last week. So if we had professionals who were hiring more and had more time to work with each of those new people who was hired, to help find the mentors, to help ensure they were getting the level of education that they need, that's actually an amazingly powerful deployment of time. Because it turns that person into somebody who's more of an expert on the things they already know about. It turns them into somebody who's more an expert on how they can deploy artificial intelligence within the space. Okay. It increases not only those skills, but their employability generally. Because of course, as employees, they may work someplace else down the future. So I think it's worth thinking about how the hours we save, can we hold on to those hours inside our institutions, rather than saying this is an opportunity for me to have fewer recruiters. Instead, how can we expand the aperture of what the recruiter actually does to ensure the success of the people who actually work there? And then similarly, how could you expand an engineering manager's time so they can work with better engineers or provide more mentoring internally? So let's just use those hours well.
Absolutely, and the mindset of enabling the workforce to focus on the things that are important. In banks, to remove this friction so you can focus more on customers. Yep. If you had a simple message for both the public sector and policy setters, as well as for businesses aiming to adapt their models, what's a few simple messages that you would give them?
I'm not sure I would say much more than we who are building tools are aiming to make, and you who are building your own internal tools are, that is an opportunity not just to increase productivity across the company or profitability or any of the things you care about, but rather to invest in the people who actually work there and the people around you.
Fantastic. I want to come to you, Bettina, in terms of your advice, particularly to the policy change makers and public sector leaders as well as business.
You know, I love your question, but it's such a tough one, and probably depending on the day, I would reply differently. Where my mind is today is that I would unapologetically ask to keep the inclusion aspect in mind. Because of course the way that technology is evolving always depends on the input. And we know that the input is incredibly limited. It is, well, on the one hand, based on certain large language models which have access to a certain amount of data, which usually is Western-centric and actually male-centric, and it's a certain type of people who, again, create that input. And so the output, which is what everybody looks at in amazement, is actually exclusive. And that inclusive piece is one that I think regulators need to keep in mind when it comes to the frameworks that need to be built. And then, of course, every organization needs to keep in mind as they're, taking that output as the new absolute reality. It isn't. It absolutely isn't. And so for us to keep just questioning, testing, being aware that we need more on the input side is key, and that we therefore are very skeptical as well about some of the elements, because it does affect the way we organize ourselves as organizations and the way we organize people to do their work.
I'm going to come to you, Alex, having walked this journey among several really remarkable tech companies over your career. You've seen the patterns before. And what advice would you have to organizations going through this change?
Well, I think if we all know the outsized impact that government plays on the ground and the continent, just given how much we rely on the work they do to be able to fuel our economies. I think it's really about how do you get governments to go from being regulators as it relates to AI to being partners, right? So how do we kind of create that scenario? And it's one of the things that we've actually been so focused as, especially with our government relations team, so to find ways to not just have it be that, of course you have to do this, you have to make sure that you partner with government on building frameworks that work and that they understand how to be able to regulate AI, for instance, that is very risk-based, so that doesn't stop innovation, but that you also find commercial models that governments look at as opportunities for them to also participate in this AI race. One of the things that we did in Togo when we landed our Equiana cable was actually enter into a JV with the government. So they had also ownership of that landing site, which of course makes it easier for them to also push to be able to get the cost of data down. That's some of the things that you need to do to be able to ensure that you're partnering with government and also other institutions, whether it's the UN Economic Commission on Africa. How do you make sure that you work with them in terms of how do you create the frameworks that allow growth, that you can create a regional data commons where everyone can bring together the information required to be able to inform business and government on the decisions they need to make to be able to fast-track growth. So I think it's really trying to move from that idea of just seeing the government as a regulator, but to really being able to form a much more closer partnership, understanding that they must play a critical role in all the things that we need to make happen in order to enable AI to truly, help us leapfrog and fast track and all the jargon that we use to really say, grow our continent.
Fantastic. And I want to bring it home back to Fred for closing comments. Africa, and you know the statistics better than anyone else, the youngest population, the fastest growing population, 1 in 4 by 2050, folks in the world and young folks in the world will be African. This is such an important part of not just African development, but global development. For you, who's been so committed to models of preparing the toolkit for a new generation of leaders, what advice do you have for companies, organizations, and other parts of the world as they prepare their workforces?
In other parts of the world?
Yes. You being a role model for many others in other parts of the world.
Well, I think we actually have the opportunity to set the pace of how AI can truly transform society and not be... So in Silicon Valley, they're solving what I call luxury problems, right? A lot of the energy that you see AI is about, making entertainment easier and all this. I mean, in Africa, we've got real problems with healthcare, with education, with, infrastructure and so forth. And so we have the opportunity to pioneer more meaningful uses of AI, right? To really solve how we run our cities, our water systems, our power grids, our telecommunications networks, all these kind of things, physical AI. So we can be the pioneers in that. And because we have no other choice but to leverage technology and AI to upskill this massive youth bunch that we have. We can be the pioneers. I mean, just yesterday we announced for the first time in the world with Anthropic a partnership to use some of their models to give every single student that is going through the Rwanda Ministry of Education and a personal tutor, a Socratic tutor, which can significantly enhance their academic performance. And we started African ALX, this program where we trained last year 700,000 people in data science and artificial intelligence. We've had delegations from Boston, from Detroit, from New York, from coming here to see how we're training AI first talent. And now we're taking that model to the United States to actually train Americans for the time of AI. So again, that shows that because we don't have the constraints of legacy, we can be the ones to leapfrog, just like we did with mobile phones, and we created mobile money here first. And now Apple Pay has mobile money. We did it here 20 years ago. So we can do the same thing with AI.
Fantastic. As we wrap up our panel, what a fantastic way to end on this theme of collective intelligence, as we say, will always trump artificial intelligence. And today we witnessed this collective intelligence across sectors. I think the challenge of everyone present here, as well as this esteemed panel and organizations, is that as we navigate the evolution of how we adapt to this world of human plus, that it's the job to bring two worlds together. Those on the one hand who are in denial of the impact of AI, and others on the other hand who are panicking. And how can leaders and forums like the B20 play a role of bringing people to the middle to create action? With that, thank you to everyone, and I hope the dialogue continues. Well done.